So we're really excited to have you here, and I just have a few questions and hope that we can just have a conversation. So the first question I have actually is for both of you, wanting to know just how you came to doing ethnographic work. So what brought you to doing ethnography?
Go ahead.
Okay. Actually, I was trained quantitatively, and I'm glad in retrospect that that's the case. You know, I had really high-level training in quantitative methods, and I was doing my dissertation in West Africa. I was doing my dissertation in Ghana, and at the time there was a very well-known framework, Alex Inkley's and these people modernization framework. It's since been, in many ways, debunked or what have you. It's not, one doesn't talk here about it anymore, but it's, and I was traveling all over Ghana. I was young. There was a lot of money back then for these kinds of things. So I was traveling all over Ghana, and I was actually looking at the production of modern attitudes among high school students in a carefully stratified sample of high schools. And it was a survey instrument that I had based on Inkley's work and other people's work at the time. And I realized the presumption was that if there was modern attitudes, there would be structural modernization. And I realized, as probably about the first week that I was in Ghana, that the United States had just dropped the price of cocoa in Ghana, which was the primary crop. And as a result of the dropping of the price in cocoa, the CEDI, was the currency, and it was actually worth very little. So the idea that a country could modernize if it had modern attitudes really was up for grabs for me very, very soon after I landed in that country. So at that time I realized I heard a lot about what was happening with the then global economy, although we didn't use that term, and America's role in that global economy, although we didn't really talk about that much at the time. And it became very clear to me that if I really wanted to understand what these issues of modernization were, I was going to have to really dig deep into interviews and so forth to see what was really going on. I didn't do that at the time. I was trying to gather my data for my dissertation, come back and write my dissertation. But it became clear to me after living overseas that I was probably destined for another kind of scholarly work. And that's how I became an ethnographer. And Michelle knows this because we've talked a lot about this, but living overseas put me in, I was gone for 2.5 years, and it really put me in a space where everything was demoored. I was demoored. All the constructs I held to be the case were demoored. Everything was not as I thought it was, and that's partly why I took myself overseas. There were scholarly reasons for being there, but there were also personal reasons for being there. And as a result of living in that space of demooring for 2.5 years, and so it was very lonely at times, but also just unbelievably invigorating. And I almost was reinvented myself, both as a person in many respects, but also as the kind of scholar I wanted to be. Mm-hmm. And I came back to the United States understanding really how really good I was at understanding other people and sort of getting inside their heads as they spoke without being judgmental. So that's how I really became a person interested in qualitative methods. That was not my original training at all.
Right, so that your time there, you became a sort of, I guess, unofficial ethnographer, and you realized that that was something that you could actually use in your future work, but you didn't change your dissertation.
No, I did not. I couldn't. I couldn't. One, I couldn't, but two, I couldn't. And three, she couldn't.
Yeah, okay.
So I just, but when I came back, I wasn't sure that I was going to go into the academy. In fact, I thought I probably wouldn't. So it was just kind of, I thought I would be working for UNESCO or UNICEF or one of the major agencies overseas. And it did not occur to me that I would be teaching at a university at that time.
Right.
So it was, no, that was, and, we had, our money went far back then. So I lived there, and it didn't cost me very much to live. It was great. Yeah. So that's sort of the basis of my story.
Great. Yeah. Michelle?
So I was trained as an experimental social psychologist. Also, very classic, traditional quantitative methods, but with an experimental design. Large-scale data. I had worked as a graduate student on a very large-scale survey of veterans and non-veterans of the Vietnam era, stratified by race and whether you were in combat or not, Vietnam or not, non-veteran. My first book was called Social Experiments with Len Sachs, and it was really an optimistic, now I would say kind of neoliberal reformist, but at that point it was like an optimistic way of saying, can we use science to improve society? And if we randomly assign community policing and traditional policing and look over time, can we see differences? If we randomly assign educational methods to different schools, controlling for demographics. So like Lois, I really appreciate that training. It's given me a kind of corduroy frame in my head about the kinds of considerations one must make if you're going to make empirical claims. Not to say that I buy the experimental stuff anymore, not to say that I want to participate in that, but I think it gives you a disciplined, in the best sense and the worst sense, way of viewing under what conditions can I make a claim that's not journalistic, that's not just political engagement, all of which I'm happy to engage in, but when can I make the claim that something is kind of systematic inquiry? And coming from an experimental frame, I then got a job at University of Pennsylvania, as you know, and Del Himes was the dean. A preeminent ethnographer, and the building, Dell's vision was complex and profoundly interdisciplinary. So I was there at a time that Irving Goffman and Bambi Shefflin and Michael Katz and Linda Brodkey and Kit Willard and Marilyn Cochran-Smith and Susan Lytle. It was an astonishing time of creating new language. It was a demooring in a different sense, I think. For me, I was like a working class kid who was suddenly in an elite university and didn't know which fork to use. On the other hand, it was a time of kind of exploding African American studies, feminist studies, beginnings of queer studies. And Dell was very committed to a kind of methodological pluralism at the Graduate Center. So many of us were hired because we did quantitative or experimental work, but many were hired because they did narrative or discourse or ethnography. Fred Erickson later came. So it was an astonishing place. Eli Anderson was there. I got to learn a lot from and with him. Lonnie Guinier was over at the law school. She and I got to write a book together, which was a quantitative analysis of race and gender at the law school. So here I am with all of these folks, and it was really like a kid in a ice cream store. I'm not a candy store kind of woman, but I am an ice cream store kind of woman. And I had done quantitative work on high school dropouts, which we called dropouts then, not pushouts. And the quantitative work that I had done convinced me that what we had in our textbooks, Pearl Rosenberg and I had done an analysis of how textbooks spoke about dropouts, and they were hopeless and helpless and depressed. And my quantitative work out of New York had demonstrated that actually they weren't helpless or hopeless or depressed. Some of the kids who stayed in school were, but the kids who had dropped out were like critical and engaged, and not to say dropping out was a good decision economically, but what motivated it was a critique and a yearning for something else. So I was interested in moving into a high school, spending a year, and actually interrogating, how does this practice, how do these outcomes get produced? What are the institutional, political, relational, and deeply racial and class dynamics that produce a graduation rate at a typical high school at that point of probably 20% of their incoming ninth graders? So I found a high school that had those characteristics, and I just planted myself, and I was learning on the job and then running back to Penn and talking to Linda and Dell and later Fred to understand For me, it was always both quantitative and qualitative. I think that's true for Lois as well. Ethnography was simply a frame to understand how does this institution understand its own practice and its own outcomes, and to what extent could I interrogate the space, but also ask probing enough questions that would crack the frame so people could talk about what held it together, what was so naturalized. And after that, I was hooked. I was really hooked on trying to understand not so much just outcomes, but the processes and the history and the historic political conditions that produce those outcomes. It was only later that I understood this was also a time of dramatic spiking of mass incarceration in the community. And so it was only later that I could layer on that some of what I was seeing was induced by the prison industrial complex. But at the time, I was kind of within education as a frame.
I think one of the things, just listening to Michelle, I mean, I actually, to tell you the truth, I didn't know until this visit that you had as extensive quantitative training as you did. But even though we talk to each other all the time and have been working together for well over 15 years now. But I think one of the things for me was what was happening in the field of sociology of education, because all of the work in the 60s and into the 70s, we were very much influenced by the work of James Coleman and Christopher Jenks and all of those people that were really looking at the relationship between family background characteristics and the kinds of outcomes that we now know are associated with, with test scores and what have you at that time. They particularly looked at things like academic achievement. And the kinds of things that we were finding there were things that needed explanation. And the only way you can really get that explanation is to dig deep into what's actually going on in classrooms and schools. And my first ethnography was actually in community college, but then I went into a white working class high school. And anyway, I've done a number since. But it's always the, like Michelle is saying, and especially as a sociologist, it's always the digging underneath to see what produces those outcomes of interest, which is why mixed methods, not as a mantra, but as something that's actually living and breathing, can be a very, very exciting way to think about scholarly work, I think, because it's a lot of those kinds of things that we know, like you say, quantitatively, we know certain things about those relationships, given the way we define variables and what have you, and the kind of tests we do, but we know certain kinds of things. But those people cannot tell us, other than maybe the people who talk about tracking, exactly what produces those kinds of relationships of interest on the ground of everyday practice. So it was that sort of scholarly work that was meshing with my own personal journey of being demoored that led me to really understand that that's where I belonged. And I'm not at all sorry I was so well trained quantitatively. I think it's allowed me and Michelle as well to sit at a lot of tables. And I also want to echo what you said, Michelle. I've increasingly begun to understand that if you don't have some kind of training in making connections and what's evidence and what kind of claims can you make, and how do you look at why the outliers are important to look at, you really end up making a lot of statements that you cannot really sustain very well.
Can you say a little bit more about that, or provide an example of how you think ethnographers can think productively about using quantitative work? I get sort of the point about, and I probably get this because I'm an ethnographer, about the value of ethnography at getting at the stories underneath and getting at the process and the production of things. But
I'm actually working on a team now. We're just about ready to release a statement, as I've mentioned to you at another point. But I don't know that ethnographers do need to do the quantitative work, actually. Some can do it if they so choose, if they're highly trained and so forth. Most probably will not. But I don't think that's the issue. I think the issue is we need, many ethnographers do not know the quantitative literature. And if you're studying, like I do, education and the production and amelioration of social and economic inequalities, you have to know what those quantitative people are saying, right? And you have to follow it very carefully, and it's got to be over time. And so in that way, that kind of work is exceedingly important, and we have to be in conversation with those people. The other thing that I think increasingly we're going to see larger teams that are going for certain kinds of grant money. And it is not true that the big places like NSF do not fund qualitative studies. They do. I have an NSF grant. But I think as we move forward, you will find certain spaces, and they might be certain universities that position in this way, certain spaces in which top quant people and top qual people are going to be sitting at the table together in order to pose those kinds of questions. And they can be iterative. I mean, a quant study can iteratively produce a qual study. A qual study can iteratively produce a quant study where you're trying to get underneath what variables mean or what have you. So, and the quant people want these qual people at the table now, just in terms of how they put together their instruments in many cases. What do things mean? So I think we're going to see more of that. It doesn't, but that means that there's got to be certain training, right? I mean, I can no longer do the kind of modeling that some of my colleagues do, but I certainly can understand its logic. I can follow the discussion very well, and I know exactly what they're talking about, and I can understand how that can be in relation. And just one more thing, and I'll stop. I have never met a top quant person that doesn't deeply appreciate qual work. And I have frankly never met a top qual person who doesn't appreciate quant work. And by that, I don't mean descriptive statistics. I mean the real kind of work that attempts to explain relationships and what have you, and outcomes of interest through these models. So I think there's actually an academic future in this kind of work, not for everybody, but there will be some places where that is going to go on. They will be within and cross-university, and probably more likely cross-university teams, just because of the way we hire.
I know that we in our department have been talking a lot about this in terms of training our graduate students, right? How to prepare them, the next generation of folks to go out, to do good work, to get jobs and those kinds of things. And, you know, we're hoping that we may yet get hires in the future. Who knows? Sure. But you know, this is part of the conversation. You know, who would we bring on board, and how would that add to the training of our grad students? The conversations that we can have in the department, that sort of thing, or you know, or should we be just looking to build greater bridges across campus, because we certainly have resources on campus, right? Is that the better route to go, particularly in developing relationships with quant folks? Is it better to bring a single person in, or is it better to really build bridges across campus? Because we certainly have really big people.
That's right, you do.
Yeah.
We've done both at the University of Buffalo, but we have strong relationships with the EdSec and quantitative methods people who ask questions about inequalities, reproduction, amelioration, same kinds of work, issues that we approach.
I think an interesting way to think about teaching this would be to have a course that was organized around a set of social issues and bring people together to see the ways in which the methods depart from, I mean, very different epistemological assumptions about who has expertise, where knowledge is. That's not a reason not to play. It's just that seems important to acknowledge. But you know, the work we've been doing on aggressive policing in the Bronx, or school suspensions in schools, almost all of that research, quantitative or qualitative, is downstream in a single space or looking at disparities across. What's interesting about quantitative training is it asks the questions compared to what? So we've been doing critical statistics comparing policing in the South Bronx in a neighborhood around Yankee Stadium with community, and in the East Village, which is mostly NYU students. Same neighborhood, same, and we've used the NYPD data as well as locally collected data. And what we find, of course, is there are many, many, many more stops in the Bronx, but they're not accurate. Like 96% of them are innocent stops. And in the East Village, actually, the cops can figure out who's got contraband. And so they're about 68% innocent stops, right? And then only with ethnography can you understand what's happening in these spaces, right? Same thing with school discipline. You know, there are 5,000 police officers in New York City schools. in those schools, they have much higher rates of suspension and arrest, of course, because there are police officers there. When there are no police officers, those issues are treated as disciplinary. It's only with understanding the local. But my worry with understanding the local is, meeting with a group of your amazing students yesterday, there's a way in which it can seem too local and too particular to the place in which you're located, unless you've got a much broader both database and set of colleagues who can inform about the ways in which these dynamics are happening nationally and globally, right? What's happening around immigrants and refugees, right? So I really appreciate conversations that address that quant and qual have different epistemological whatevers, but I think a conversation between them, it's like a conversation between performance artists and scientists. Those are beautiful conversations, and they don't assume sameness. So I don't know that we're still in big wars about this, but I think we're beyond the wars, but I do think, but I do think it would be interesting to teach around work, not just technique, because I think teaching technique around questions. Yeah.
I think one thing also about qual work, Stacy, you, Michelle, and there's numerous others, okay? But there's, many of us situate our qual work, even if it's in one site. That site is chosen for a particular reason, and we're very clear why we chose that site. Your school represented, when you did framing dropouts, every single site I was in represented something larger than itself. It is not the case that I was just in a school. I was in a very particular kind of school, and it's a school that represents a lot of schools in a particularly located area. When I did the white working class school, then the question is, if I had gone into, for example, Atlanta, Georgia, or Los Angeles, California, would I have found the same thing, and if so, what, and if not, and this is where our original quant training comes into play. If not, what are the key differences? And I think, part of this is, yes, it's good to think about these mixed methods, big conversations, not little conversations, big conversations, not paradigm wars. But I also think, frankly, that ethnographers should more consciously situate our choices inside questions of what this represents, so that it's not just a single school. I'm never in a single school. I'm in a school that represents something larger than that one site that I'm in. And that's what's allowed us to, that's what's allowed me and three of us sitting here to gain the kind of scholarly power that we've been able to gain.
I want to underscore that because, again, talking to your students or my students or the question of what is this an instance of is a really important question. I don't think we teach it. In fact, to the contrary, I often hear people who do qualitative methods saying, I know I can't generalize, I know I can't, and then it contains it. And so I've written a little about theoretical generalizability rather than empirical.
I call it intellectual generalizability.
Or provocative generalizability. That is, what does this provoke in other settings that might have an echo, but not the same sound. It's when I first did framing dropouts, I went up to northern Maine and I was at some meeting, and the parents said the same thing happens here, and I thought that is really ridiculous. These are such different neighborhoods. But what they were saying is some group of kids becomes disposable and we no longer attend to them. That was so useful to me to understand this wasn't just urban, race, black, whatever, even though, of course, it was also that. So this question, and we were just talking about this, like, what's your work an instance of? And I don't know that we always teach that. And I hear a kind of really with qualitative researchers, particularly students, I know I'm only talking to 6 Latinas and I can't generalize, but it is important to think, what does it bounce off of? What does it provoke you to think about beyond your case?
I also think,
how does it connect to larger?
And then how does it connect? Exactly.
That's right.
Historically,
Debates. I know there are some qual people who find the AERA standards for publishing in empirical journals controversial, but they are really useful. because that's exactly the kind of questions, the issues that are laid out in there, both for quantitative and qualitative. And they're really, really helpful for graduate students as well as faculty members. And if you want to get published in top journals, which is an increasing pressure on faculty members now, for a wide range of reasons. One, bad reasons, they can be counted. At the same time, if you want to do that, and some of us are going to have to do that for a wide range of reasons, you have to know these things. It's because that's exactly what journal editors are looking at, and not just, it's not only education that looks at that statement from AERA. There's a number of social science fields that take that statement very seriously now. And it has actually been taken up by NSF, and at least it's sort of a guiding set of, and you don't know what you don't know, right? And people say, well, we can't get NSF money. Well, I mean, there's ways that one has to position one's work, and I think that's perfectly fair, actually, to get those kinds of funds and to get in those kinds of journals. And I don't know if you agree with that.
Yeah, no, I do. I was thinking qualitative or ethnographic works helps reimagine the shape of the problem, right? That all of my quantitative and my colleagues' quantitative work, the problem is defined before.
That's right.
Right? And that's useful, but it's defined before. Ethnographic work, it's why your literature review no longer works when you're done, because the shape of the problem has shifted. That I find that thrilling. I could imagine why people find that frustrating, and you change your question. But that's why that interplay, I think, is just kind of interesting.
Totally agree.
Great. So I know we have not much more time, so I just wanted, the last question I had actually was about the work that the two of you have done together, sort of, if you could speak to collaborative work, some, and your experience.
I don't know. I think we just fell in love. Fell in love in the 90s. After Framing Dropouts, Lois contacted me and said, let's talk.
No, there's a different story there, though, Michelle.
Go ahead.
Okay, so
see, love stories always have many origins.
This is too much. Okay, the story is, and you'll remember it when I tell it to you, I was on the SUNY press board, and I was responsible for reading. I was presenting Framing Dropouts, and I read this book, and I said, wait a minute here. Who is this woman? I could have written that book. And the language, the language, the way that it was presented, the stories, I mean, I don't mean to be arrogant, but the power. I mean, I could feel this volume. And I happened to be going to Philly to give a talk. And so I contacted Michelle. I said, I think we got to meet. Like I just read, I was the person responsible for talking about framing dropouts at the SUNY press board. And she said, wait a minute, is this Lois Weis? I said, yes, this is Lois Weis. And she said, I just reviewed Working Class Without Work. And you said, I felt exactly the same way. Like there were two different projects, right? I mean, one was with very, very poor kids in high school. I was working in what we then called a deindustrialized community. Now we know it's the tip of the iceberg on the global knowledge, the emerging global knowledge economy, soon to be gentrified. But in her case, it was really the sort of what we had done in there, and a lot of it was that connection with the larger social structure, and what it meant in terms of who exactly were we working with. So then we met in a train station, the Philly train station.
I remember that. Yep.
And by the time that conversation was ended, I said to Michelle, why don't you come and do Beyond, the second version of Beyond Silence Voices with me? Because it'll be much better if you join me, which in fact it was. And that's...
So you did the edited book project together first bore you engaged in any empirical work.
Then we did Off-White.
No, then we did the Spencer Grant.
Then we did the Spencer Grant.
Okay.
Then we
That resulted in
Unknown City came out of that. Okay.
And I think maybe too simply, I think actually I was just saying this to Lois, I think we're both women who love our sisters. And I think that really matters. I just do. I've met people who hate their sisters, and often it's not as easy. So I think that matters. We were both traditionally trained and then and brought that traditional training to a more expansive view of methods. I don't know that we ever had that conversation. We both really love theory, history, and research.
Right.
At one point, we were envious a little of friends who were just doing critical theory and didn't let data get in their way.
I was never envious.
Well, you know what? I was friends.
Never envious.
I was good friends with Jim Birkin. Jim Birkin of Birkin Garvey Publishers, and he was publishing Freire and Henry and all the guys. And he would send me all their stuff, and I'm like, so cool, they get to say stuff. And and we're like, inhibited by or accountable to what real people say. But I also think we really trust each other. Like, we can finish each other's sentences. We don't always agree, but we could write each other's stuff and we can rewrite it. We've gone in different directions, but bring the core of our commitments to each other. And I think we're both white Jewish women who have lived at funny edges. In our personal lives, in our political lives, in our professional lives. We've chosen to be at those edges. And I don't think that's irrelevant.
I think a couple other things, and I've seen this. If you can have no teamwork if you have big egos sitting in the room.
Yeah.
Forget it. Forget it. I don't care. I don't care if you're in the arts. I don't care. It doesn't work very well. I mean, you've got to be able to take the hit.
Yeah.
And you've got to be able to listen to other people and not be freaked out by what they say and think you're not good anymore. And you've got to, our whole business really is about critique.
Yeah.
I mean, we take it. That's what we do.
Constant microaggression. That's my newest sentence.
It's a constant. I love critique. My stuff is never as good without it as it is. I want it. I don't want people to say, wow, this is fabulous. I don't want that. And Michelle felt the same way. So it was really and continues to be a very positive working relationship. So we stopped writing. The story of how we went in different directions is an interesting one. At the end of, we did 3 big grants together, right? 3. We did 2 Spencer, big grants, and then a 3rd Carnegie. So we had years of working together on grants and then years of producing stuff. By the way, not everybody produces stuff off grants.
I know.
And we are not a bank. The university is not a bank yet. You're supposed to write the stuff up.
Right.
So anyway, we had spent 15 years doing it. And then for a range of reasons, we kind of went in different directions. And that's another thing that we need to explore at some point. But we came back to, I actually had this idea, we really got to update compositional studies because it's boring and nobody read it. So I said, Michelle, we've got to redo this. I'll take the first cut. And that's how we produce critical bifocality. Then immediately after that.
And I got bifocals. And that's how the name
She's the title person. She's the bifocal person. And
speed bumps also.
Speed bumps.
I
She's
moved
the one
to the suburbs.
Her personal is constantly in titles. So watch Michelle's titles.
Exactly. I could just go to my therapist and bring all the titles.
It's a title on the table. So we did that, and then we did another paper responding to Doug Foley's charge to the field of anthropology. So that was the second iteration of the bifocal idea. But it actually felt, after 5 years of not writing a word together, it felt like we'd never stopped. And that was weird. That was really weird.
Pretty amazing, though.
It is
Pretty
amazing.
cool.
Yeah, it's pretty cool.
Pretty cool.
And I don't think, you can't wish that one.
Yeah.
You can't. And we had a lot of students in the loop.
Yeah.
Which is a whole other conversation that we can have at another time. But a lot. We have had a lot of students in these writing loops, research and writing loops over the years.
Which is also really amazing for them, and you learn from them, and they're learning from each other.
Yeah, it's got its own rhythms.
Yeah.
And then we have other people we love, like Stacy Lee.
Yes.
And then we both love her, and so it's just
Stacy, your work is just amazing.
Oh, well,
it's
we're gonna have that on
amazing. Yeah, it definitely has to be on tape in the archives in 100 years.
You are
we need
one
to
of the
remember
people
that.
who really takes that. I mean, both the first one, unraveling model minorities, but also particularly that question with the Hmong. You take what you had ethnographically and write it with and against all of these broader issues, and that is. I mean, it would be brilliant ethnography without that, but to me that's what gives it its big, it makes it in conversation with all sorts of other things.
So I'm revisiting that work now.
Oh,
with a
good.
team of grad
Are you?
students.
Terrific.
Yeah, with
That's fun.
a couple of Hmong students and a Cambodian student. Part of why I hadn't been doing work with that community was I'd come to feel that as an ethnic outsider, given the sort of way that the Hmong community has been positioned, that perhaps it really wasn't my right to do that work anymore. I got some money, and then I got these grad students, and I realized that people still weren't doing, I thought
Right.
maybe people would take it up, but they hadn't. And so I started talking to my grad students, and so we've formed a team, and they've helped me think through kind of how to.
That's great.
We're talking, I shouldn't say we, it's actually they are, because I don't have the language skills, talking to parents as well as various community leaders, and we're inside and outside of schools. And
That's great.
This is another reason why we have to do what we're planning to do with University of Buffalo and University of Wisconsin.
Yeah.
Because we have people in the Burmese community. We have, people in varying communities really posing up, and one of them actually is interested in questions of activism.
Yeah.
So, but this is how teams get formed.
Right.
I mean, I don't mean this as negatively as it's going to sound, but there's a lot of pressure on administrators to produce teamwork because you can get money. Not always. I mean, some work doesn't have to be teamwork, but there are some issues around, at least you have to have lots of graduate students working. You can't do this stuff by yourself.
Yeah.
And sometimes it works that there's other faculty at some level. But the administrators now are under so much pressure to produce these kinds of things for academic analytics and all sorts of, high, what do they call it? High impact publications. And, there's a whole language around this, which you're less subject to at CUNY than we are right now. But, and so there's this bizarre notion that you just sort of, let's just invite everybody to sit at the table and we'll figure out a question. It just doesn't work like that.
Yeah.
I mean, it's all about what work people have done, and then is it going to work interpersonally beyond the sort of can we probe this stuff intellectually?
I think the question you raised, though, about who am I to be in this community is one that's surfacing dramatically, finally. It's been raised by Indigenous folks for a long time, and it's really why we do now all this participatory work, which has its own colonial possibilities, right? But one of the questions I've been thinking about that we're going to have a course, Ana Ramos Zayas is going to be teaching a course on studying up. And it's interesting for us to think about, do we have the same ethical questions when we study privilege as when we study
Very interesting.
low-income, marginalized community? Is this like Peter, what's good for Peter is Paul, whatever? Or do we have a different stance with respect to whose stories get stolen, get represented, exposing.
It's very interesting.
And it's kind of interesting. It feels like the next tier of work. Anyway.
Yeah, and I was in the privilege school, and we confront dilemmas every step of the way, and I don't care who we are or where we are or what we're doing, and you have to be an adult, and you have to really think carefully what you're doing, what you expose, what you talk about, who you talk to, and then what you do with the stuff when you get it.
We had a great, this Anna put together a group of anthropologists, sociologists, and social psychology, me, on this studying up, and Ruben was there. It was just really interesting. When did they threaten lawsuits? When do you just know not to go there? When do you, and why do we feel like low-income communities are low-hanging fruit, where we can just publish and say what we want and not reflect on our own position, not contextualize,
We
not.
do reflect.
We do. Not everybody does.
No, I know.
The
That's
Academy
absolutely
has
true.
been lousy about
I
that.
agree
They
with
have engaged in
I agree with
what
that.
Spivak calls epistemic violence,
Yeah.
and I would agree.
I
When
totally
my
agree.
students of color from working class communities come to the Academy and see how psychology has represented their communities, they're appalled, and they don't want that to be their literature review, and I don't quite blame them. It feels like standing on Nazi documents about Jews. So I think we have to think all of that, and that was just provoked by your rethinking how and when one enters a community, not your own.
And I also think we need to be, I don't mean the sort of narcissistic self-reflection and writing about ourselves. I mean, that's just not And, but we have to think about who we are, honestly, who we are. And what kinds of, when we leap to judgment, which at some level we do when we write this stuff up, I mean, we really have to ask ourselves very serious questions. Who would we be with if they were them, if we were them? I don't care what community you're in. I mean, I could be in a Fortune 500 boardroom, okay? And I would have to ask myself, who would I be if I was those people? And Michelle and I asked this constantly, remember, like, that's how we wrote Speed Bumps and all that. Who would we be, and not be snotty and judgmental? And I mean, obviously, we have to theorize the stuff, right? We're the analysts. We have to theorize it.
And how do we work off of the dominant representation of that group? Because that's, how is this going to be reused to deport whomever or criminalize whomever? And it's a craft. That part is a craft.
Right.
And my quantitative friends sometimes think a lot about this and sometimes don't. And my qualitative friends sometimes think a lot about this and sometimes don't.
We're no better than the quant people.
That's my point.
Respects.
That's my point.
I really believe that. We are, I think, okay.
Bill Cross, my colleague, who
Potentially
is
more dangerous, right?
We're very dangerous.
Yeah, potentially.
The press loves the kind of stuff we've got.
Yeah.
And it's so easy to be misrepresented. You've got to really keep your eye on this and not get caught up with, oh, isn't this wonderful? I'm being interviewed by
Bill
the press.
Cross, when he first came to CUNY, and there was so much qualitative, he's a major black psychologist. He said that when he was in graduate school at Princeton, black psychologists were like, we're not doing qualitative work because it has just done so much damage to our community. We are all getting highly trained in quantitative to prove it wrong. And so that was such an interesting history, and it's humbled me to think through, how do we think about ethics in both of these settings, and appropriation of the work and misrepresentation. Thanks, Stacy.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thanks, Stacy.
It was great. It was so fun to talk.
Yeah, it was really fun.